everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Biggest Mistakes to Avoid When Presenting to Senior Management, which is brought to you by GoToMeeting. My name is Julia, and I'll be your host today. I'm dialed in from Germany today. My colleague Gemma from the UK is in the background for all technical questions, and I'm happy to do this webinar from Germany for you today. So today we're going to have a 45-minute webinar, which will consist of a presentation followed by a Q&A session. So if you have any questions or comments, please submit them via the questions box, which you'll see within your GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your PC. I will keep an eye on those throughout the webinar, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So joining me today is Maurice de Castro, who is founder of mindfulpresenter.com. Maurice has been an executive himself for some of the UK's most successful brands and knows exactly what senior managers want to see in a presentation and, most importantly, the mistakes that need to be avoided. So thanks for joining us, Maurice, and let's jump into the presentation now. The stage is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julia. Thanks for that introduction. And good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be on this webinar. One of the reasons being was that I wrote the article, The 7 Mistakes to Avoid When Presenting to Senior Managers, almost a year ago now. I think it was April. Hopefully some of you will have read it during that time, which I'm guessing may have prompted you, amongst other reasons, to join the webinar. But when we look back, nearly a year has passed, and that article was very successful. I think it's had something like 26,000 views. And initially I was a bit surprised about that. But then when I stop to think about it and reflect on it, I think, why on earth am I surprised? It's what I spend together with my team at Mindful Presenter most of our time, every week we're going into organizations, and the biggest issue that we face is helping people to present their ideas with impact and far more effectively to senior managers. Because sometimes, as you know, it can be a pretty tough thing presenting anyway. A lot of people find it quite daunting. Some people find it quite uncomfortable. And when it comes to the prospect of presenting to senior managers, then sometimes that can actually look a bit scary. In fact, this slide here represents perhaps, I guess, an exaggerated image of what it could look like. But having said that, as Julia mentioned, my background is corporate. Before I got involved in presentation skills training and coaching, which I've been doing for several years now, I used to sit in front of boards like this, senior management teams like this. And it reminds me of a time when one particular brand I worked for, where I was leading a huge project, and I needed to call in the help of some consultants, some external consultants, to really make sure we nailed it down and got it right. And there was a point when we were making some real good progress that I needed to get the senior consultant to join me at a board meeting to help me to present where we were. And I knew how difficult this senior management team could be, because obviously I sat on the board for years and I'd seen people come in and out myself. And so I did my best to counsel and coach and guide the consultant to make sure that she was as prepared and as effective on the day. And what happened was the day came and she stood and presented with me, and she did a great job as far as I recall. But I could tell she was a little nervous. I could tell she was a little bit anxious. So afterwards I made a point of asking her, well, how did you feel? How did you feel when you were doing that? And she said something that I've never really forgotten. And keep in mind, this was something like 10 years ago. She said this. She said, Maurice, it was okay. She said it was okay. She said, but I had this uneasy feeling all the way through it. She said, it felt a bit like I was presenting to my gynecologist. I know that sounds crazy, but bear with me. This is what she said. She said, they're very polite and very respectful and even very charming and friendly. But she said, I had this uneasy feeling that at any moment I was going to be left feeling violated. And I thought, wow, that's a hell of a thing to say, a powerful thing to say. But that's how she felt, because that was the impression that they gave. Now, I've never presented to a gynecologist. Thankfully, I don't have one, so I don't have that issue. But I kind of know how she feels. And when I think about presenting in general, to be a mindful presenter, I often think the starting point has to be to really understand and tune into how we feel as professionals ourselves and as presenters. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to, in a moment with Julia's help, is to open up just a little poll to get your perspective on things and to see how you think as an audience. Because what I'd like to know is how you feel when you're presenting to senior management. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Julia just to talk through this poll, and then we'll look at the results together and see what the consensus is.
Great,
Julia?
Thanks, Morris. Yeah, so I've already started the poll, so you have seen a blue window popping up, and you can just make your choice and tell us, how do you feel? Do you say, I'm extremely anxious and I lose a lot of sleep over it? I'd rather not, but I grit my teeth and get through it. It's something I enjoy and look forward to. It's part of the job, so I'm quite relaxed about it. So please take your choice now. And I already see in my control panel that 61% of you have already voted. So we will give it some more minutes so that everyone can join and we get a representative result. Oh, we're at 80% already who have voted, so I think we can stop the poll here and I will show you the results. So Morris, we see that 44% say, I'd rather not, but I grit my teeth and get through it. 23% say D, 18% say A, and 14% say C.
Okay, that's great, Julia. Thanks for talking us through that. So the interesting thing is, and the good news is, some people actually enjoy it and look forward to it, which is brilliant because it is an opportunity. It's a huge opportunity for all of us within our careers, but most of us are uncomfortable with it, as you can see. In fact, 18% are extremely anxious, and that's not at all uncommon. In fact, I remember a quote, one of my favorite quotes, I believe it was Mark Twain, that was once quoted as saying, really there are only two types of speaker. There are those that are nervous and there are those that are liars. Now, I'm not calling those of you who enjoy it liars, of course, but what I'm saying is we all get nervous to some degree. And if you can enjoy it, that's brilliant. But we're all going to feel some level of anxiety, some level of nerves. The poll says that 44% of you would rather not, but you grit your teeth and get through it. And I completely understand that. It's part of the job. We're here to do that. We have a job to do and a mission. So we kind of just get on with it. But the question is it's, understanding how we feel, we then need to think, well, why is it so painful? Why do we feel like that? Now, I came across a book a while back. Hopefully you can see this. It's a book called Pitch Anything. It's one of my favorite books. You might want to read it if you get the opportunity. And it's written by a great author called Oren Klaff. And the book sets out something that, in an illustrative context within the first chapter, why it's so painful. And it works like this. What Oren explains is that we have basically three parts of the brain. So whereas, we've all grown up thinking we've got the left brain and the right brain, there are actually three parts. We've got this thing called the reptilian brain, which is actually the oldest part of the brain. Now, the reptilian brain, I believe, is some 400 or 500 million years old. And it's the part of the brain that's responsible for our vital functions, our heart rate, our breathing, our temperature, our balance. But crucially, it's the part of the brain that was built for survival, that instinctive brain, that reactive brain, that fight or flight brain. And the next part of the brain is what's called the midbrain or the limbic brain. And the limbic brain is the thinking brain. It's kind of the seat of all of our value judgments. It's the behavioral brain. And then as we evolved as beings, human beings, we then evolved this thing called the neocortex. And the neocortex is the frontal lobe. It's the biggest part of the brain, the newest part. But it's responsible for imagination and consciousness and higher level thinking. It's a part of the brain that enabled us decades ago to put a man on the moon, allegedly, and that's another story, of course. And one day, hopefully, find the cure to things like cancer and do incredible things that we do all the time. So I share that with you because in the Oren Klaff's book, Pitch Anything, what he explains is that when we're presenting, especially, of course, to people in senior management positions, the first thing that kicks in, albeit on a subconscious level, we're not even aware of it, is the reptilian brain. Because the reptilian brain is taking over and saying, well, actually, this feels like a survival situation. I'm in front of all these senior managers, and yes, I've prepared. Yes, I know my stuff. I'm an expert in my subject, but suddenly I feel vulnerable. I'm exposed. Something could go wrong. They could ask me a question I don't know the answer to. I could forget something. I could freeze. So suddenly we feel a bit primitive, if you like. We feel a bit like prey, and the audience, being senior management, are predators. That's a crude example, but that relates back to the reptilian brain. So we need to understand that. And the other reason it's important is because often when we're crafting and preparing our presentation, most people that I've seen in my experience as a presenter in the corporate world, they prepare for the neocortex, so they prepare for the higher thinking brain, rather than saying, actually, you know, my first task, my first job is to make sure that my audience feel comfortable, that they feel safe, so they don't feel threatened and they know they're in the right place. So that's you know, part of the reason why it's so painful and why we feel the way we do. And another part is this: I believe that as presenters, we all live in this interesting house, and I call it the house of me. And we're all there, we're in there in life in general, but it's really very prominent when we're presenting, because the house of me says, you know, I really want to look good, especially in front of my senior management team. Nobody wants to look bad, of course, but we all want to look really, really good. That means that we craft and deliver our presentation to demonstrate how knowledgeable we are, how hardworking we are, how impressive we can be when we're on our feet, and how dedicated we are. And in the process of doing that, that triggers the reptilian brain even more so to say, because it's all about me, there's an enormous amount of anxiety that can often hinder and hold us back sometimes. When sometimes we need to say, well, actually, where do they live? You know, we're presenting to this group of senior managers. We may know them, we may have worked with them very closely, we may even be part of the team. But where do they live? What's going on in their house? And let's have a quick look at their house, because you know, it's similar to ours in terms of the same number of rooms, and they have the same front door. In other words, they also want to look good. As a management team, they want to look good, they want the company to look good, they want shareholders, stakeholders, they even want you to look good as a member of the team and as a presenter. But there's all this other stuff going on in their world, as there is in yours, of course. But there are things like, you know, how do we get competitive advantage, and how do we grow and reduce costs? And if you go up into the loft, there's all this stuff that's constantly at the forefront of their mind, and there are huge challenges that they have to entertain. So our job as presenters is to sometimes just stand back and take ourselves out of the house of me and go into the house of the audience that we're presenting to, our senior managers, and put ourselves in their shoes. And to do that, we need to think about the way we think. We really do, because thinking is a universal challenge. In fact, I believe it was George Bernard Shaw that was once quoted as saying that he believed that 2% of people think, 3% of people think they think, and 95% of people would rather die than think. Now, I know that sounds outrageous, it's a crazy quote, but I believe that's what he said. Because we all believe we think, and we all believe we think well and effectively, but actually thinking's hard. And when it comes to presenting, it's particularly hard. And here's why. I'm going to open up another poll now, and I'd like Julia to run through this poll, because this poll is about saying, well, if you think about how many thoughts we have each day, and we all have a vast number of thoughts, as you can imagine. In fact, some research says that we have between 50 and 80,000 thoughts every day. But think about, you know, the average person on the planet, including yourself. I'd like you to, Julia, to open up this poll to see how you think.
Yes, thanks, Morris. I've already opened it up. So you see a blue window and can again vote within this window and tell us how many of your thoughts are similar to previous days. 25%, 47%, 75%, or 83%. So please vote within this blue window now. And I already see that 71% of you have already voted. We will give it a couple of more seconds. So we're over 80% now. I think we can close the poll at this point, and I will show you the results. Yeah, interesting. We see that 40% say 75%, 26% say 83%, 25% say 47%, and 10% say 25%.
Okay, thanks, Julia. That's brilliant. And isn't it interesting? How often do we stop to think how we think? It's a question I ask all the time since I stumbled across some of this research. And I've read two pieces of research, one by the NSF, the National Science Foundation, which is a multi-billion-dollar organization in the States. And since then, I've seen similar numbers by the Laboratory of Neuroimaging. And some of you may be saying, well, how on earth does anybody know how many thoughts we have? Well, I work on the basis that if we can put a man or a woman in a lump of titanium and send them 250,000 miles to the moon in 3 days, and to land that thing with the precision of a fraction of a second, then maybe organizations with billions of pounds or dollars and all of the technology can get close to understanding how we think. So most of you think we have a lot of thoughts, i.e. 25%, 40%, or sorry, 47%, 75%, or 83%. The answer, actually, from the research that's been done, is closer to 75% of our thoughts are the same or similar every day. In other words, they're recycled, repetitive thoughts. Now, that's really interesting. So when you think, that's probably no surprise to you, because we're creatures of habit. We're conditioned to live our lives through habit. And in many respects, that's a good thing, as you can imagine. But when it comes to presenting, what that means is that often we're doing the same thing over and over again. And we see it every week as mindful presenters when we go in to help businesses. People firing up the same laptop, using the same templates, the same charts and graphs, the same information, the same tone of voice, the same approach. And that's why it becomes a huge struggle for both them as the presenter and crucially the audience, the senior management team as an audience, because they see and hear the same thing all the time. So it can become quite monotonous and quite tedious. So it's our job as presenters to really find out, well, what is it can make the difference, so we can challenge the status quo and to break those patterns. And then really that's all about saying, well, where do you start? In our business, mindful presenting is about saying, well, how do we take the whole thing apart and take you apart as presenter in the nicest possible way? What I mean by that is the way you think about your presentation, the way you craft it, the way you craft and structure your content, and the way you deliver it. So it's the whole package that we look at, not just one or two elements. And to do that, we often think, well, what is it that people want from a presentation? Whether you're senior managers or not, it doesn't matter who you are, what position or status you hold. I believe, and we believe at Mindful Presenter, that every audience wants at least one of these 4 things from you. Some people want more. They want a level of insight, so they want a deeper understanding of what the message is and why it's important and how it can help them. And they want to get into that level of detail of really getting to grips with what is it you mean and how can they understand it to the same level that you do that will impact them. They want, of course, to feel some level of success in thinking that the idea that you are sharing and the message you're sharing is going to make a difference, a tangible difference to them. And of course, we all want to feel something. As human beings, we're hardwired to feel. And I call that happiness. So happiness is just one way of saying we want to feel good about whatever that message is that you're presenting. In the Dalai Lama's book, The Purpose of Life, the very first line, I believe, the first chapter, he said the purpose of life is happiness. And I think you can apply that to a presentation as well. It might sound strange to you, but how do we make people feel good? And the other piece of that jigsaw is freedom. And freedom in the context of, if you remember that slide I showed you, that image of the house with so much going on in the world of senior managers, as there is in our own worlds, our respective worlds. So how do we free ourselves from some of these challenges and these problems and these issues and these things that are holding us back in so many different ways and that we need to resolve? So that's often what we need to help people with. And the tool that we have is the gift of being able to present effectively using our mind, our body, our voice, of course, in terms of vocal variety, and this thing called spirit. Now, I'm not talking about religion or anything deep or meaningful in that context. What I'm talking about when I refer to spirit is I'm talking about, as human beings, our sense of presence. We have this level of presence and the energy that we can tune into to really bring a presentation to life and to animate it. So we can challenge that cycle of repetitive thinking that senior managers hear and see all day. And as we do that, really there are 3 key elements from a mindful presenting perspective that we need to look at. And this is where we're going to move into for the rest of the webinar to help us say, well, how do we avoid some of the mistakes that people make that we see every week? The first of all is strategy. A lot of people think that hope is a strategy. And I've seen many presenters believe that hope is a strategy. And I love hope. I live in hope as well. But hope isn't a strategy, especially when it comes to presenting. We need to prepare and craft and rehearse, and we need to do an awful lot to make sure that we deliver our message with impact. And as we begin to develop that strategy, then we can start to think about, well, actually, presenting isn't new. We've been doing it for 2,500 years to each other. And in business, it's done, hundreds of times in organizations, big organizations, every day. So we can learn from the mistakes. We can learn from the slip-ups. So we need to look at those. Because as we understand, what can go wrong as well as what can go right, we can then look for those solutions and really have the impact that we want. So let's talk about strategy. Strategy is crucial when it comes to presenting. And there are so many books, as you know, written on strategy and articles written on it. But let's talk about it just in the context of presenting and communicating, because it doesn't have to be as complex or as daunting as it sounds by any stretch of the imagination. Here's what I think we need to consider when we're building a strategy for presenting. I always say to people that the very last thing that needs to open up is your laptop. The laptop stifles innovation, it stifles creativity, and it puts us into that cycle of repetitive thinking, that 75%. So what I do, and I recommend that our clients do, is to start with Post-it notes. And so the first thing we need to do as part of our strategical thinking is to create the message. So what is it that we're trying to achieve? What is our message to our senior management team? They can't remember everything. They're human beings just like the rest of us. So if you could really focus and harness and clarify your message, let's say in the form of a tweet, because Twitter and tweeting is all the rage these days, then what would that message be? So we would craft our message in 140 characters or less, because unless we can really do that, then it's difficult to actually focus with that laser-like clarity on what it is. But as we can do that, that's when it gets interesting, because then we say, okay, we're really, really clear on the one thing that we want to get through to our senior management team, that we really, really want them to get and understand. And then we start to think strategically about how do we want them to think about that message? How do we want them to think about it? Because as you see, as we do that, then we can ask the next question as part of our strategy, what do we want them to feel? See, we're emotional beings. In most of our decisions, it doesn't matter whether you're the CEO or the chairman, we'll look at the data and we'll look at the facts and the evidence and we'll analyze things to death. But as we all know, we make a lot of our decisions, if not most of our decisions, emotionally. So how do we want our senior managers to feel about what it is we're saying and why we're saying it? And then it gets even more interesting, because what do we want them to do? What do we want that group of people, senior people, professionals, to do the moment we finish speaking? Because as we do that, as we build our strategy, and I encourage everybody to think about those Post-it notes and those elements in the form of a tweet, so keeping them very succinct, very precise, and very laser-like. Then we can start to look at the slip-ups. So we say, okay, we know what our message is, we know what we want our audience to think, feel, and do. Now, given that professionals have been presenting for so long now, let's learn from some of those mistakes. And that's what that article that I wrote back in April 2015 was about. The first piece is to say, well, more is too much. One of the problems that senior managers face, indeed all of us, because I attend many presentations myself, and in fact I wrote another article not so long ago that said most business presentations are far too long, because if you go back to that house of me with that intention and desire, albeit largely subconscious, that we want to look good and impress and show how hardworking and dedicated we are, we tend to give too much information to the senior management team. And our job is to filter through that. It's a bit like mining for gold, in the olden days back in the 1800s, where you'd pan for gold and you'd look for the nuggets. You weren't interested in the dirt and the rocks and the debris and all that kind of stuff, and neither is the senior management team. They just want the gold. So it's about less is more. And that's really the first mistake that we see. People going into senior management meetings and board meetings And I call it data dumping, just dumping all this information onto people. And basically what they're saying is, there you go, I've done my bit, now you need to work it out. It doesn't work. It's a huge mistake, and nobody thanks you for it. So we need to look for the gold. And as we do that, the other mistake is making people read. Think about the senior management team as you may think about yourself. We're bombarded with emails and reports and managed information documents and articles all day long. And when we go home, we have the same thing. So the last thing we want to do when we're in a presentation is to read. So often you'll get something like this. I see it all the time. I see it in some of the biggest brands that we work with in the world. They're still doing this, even though everybody knows not to do it. It's a huge mistake. Never ever make your senior management team read, certainly not to this extent. And the way to avoid that is to use images, and headlines. Slides, if you're going to use visual aids at all, they should be like billboards. You know, you get a few seconds to get it, so make sure it's compelling, it's colorful, it's powerful, it's really relevant, and it's meaningful. So whatever you do, please, please don't make them read. The other thing I say, another mistake, is that I often think a lot of professionals consider themselves to be comedians. Now what I mean by that is, I don't think they think they're funny. What I mean by that, and again it's just a habitual process, is they leave the punchline to the end. Now from a comedian's perspective, that's how they get their laughs. That's what the whole thing is based on, comedy is based on. And you know, it worked. You save the punchline till the end. You tell the story and then you hit them with the punchline. But how many times have you been on the receiving end of a presentation where the presenter has done that? So they've given you all of this detail, all of this data, all of this information, and then told you what you really need to know right at the end. And it's too late. So we're not comedians. We need to, especially when it comes to senior management, deliver our message up front to give them the punchline as early as possible so they know they're in the right room, so they're curious, they're interested, and they're engaged. And then don't be dull. You know, it seems to me that a lot of people in business, a lot of professionals lose that energy. And energy and enthusiasm are highly infectious. And that's what your senior management team need. You know, they need to believe in you, and the only way they can believe in you is if you believe in yourself. And that comes from movement, it comes from vocal variety, it comes from eye contact, it comes from energy and presence. So the last thing they want is that robotic, monotone delivery that says, here I am, the corporate spokesperson, and I just deliver the same as everybody else. So there's an opportunity to challenge the status quo there. Because as I say, it's a big mistake we see, again, every week. And the other mistake that we see is a lot of people playing it safe, you know, because we're conditioned to be creatures of habit, use the same templates, the same approach, and we can be different, and we can be more thought-provoking. We can tell stories, use anecdotes, analogies, similes. We can get them doing stuff in the form of exercises or just doing something in the presentation, even using props. So sometimes breaking that inertia and that safety and getting people to step outside their comfort zones as well. And why not? Senior managers are used to it. And that's what they want as well. They want to be challenged and stimulated to think, not just have this information dumped on them. So sometimes we need to take the stabilizers off the bike and to help people to think differently. And we need to help people connect. We need to connect with our management team because they see the same thing over and over again, and what they long for is that personal, almost intimate human connection. And one way of doing that is just showing them the real you. And sometimes we just call that self-disclosure. It's letting them know how you feel, being prepared to be a little bit vulnerable, being prepared to be open, and just making that connection, telling them some stories, personal stories about yourself and your experience about this project or this idea or what you're working on. And then the last thing is to don't hide. We see so many professionals hiding. You may be able to relate to this. You may have, you know, known somebody in business for years and years and suddenly had the opportunity to see them present for the first time, and as they stand up to present, you think to yourself, well, what on earth happened to Morris? that's not the person I've known all this time. What happened? Where's he gone? Because suddenly we think, okay, we're in presentation mode. It's a bit like our telephone voice, where we have to be this corporate spokesperson and we have to hide behind this kind of facade. But what we need is we need to be our real selves. We need to be authentic and just tell it as it is in the most professional way that we can, of course, but not hiding behind some shadow of being a corporate spokesperson. Because senior managers, the one thing they long for more than anything else, once they get the information that's going to help them, is to have a conversation about it. And you can't do that if you're hiding behind this corporate shield. So we can take a lot of that pain away. We really can, just by focusing on those 7 mistakes that so many people make in business every day. And they just take focus, they take awareness, a little bit of mindfulness and practice. Because then, and only then, we can really focus on the solution. And the solution is saying, okay, well, how do we apply those 7 elements in terms of avoiding those mistakes? But also, we need to have a structure that's robust and flexible enough to say, not only am I not going to make those mistakes, but actually I'm going to deliver and craft and deliver my presentation in a way that really gets results. I came across a model quite a few years ago now when I first stepped into the world of presentation training, having been a presenter for many years in the corporate world. And the model looks like this. And if you use this in your crafting your presentations, you'll find it goes an incredibly long way into you not just avoiding those mistakes, but creating a really compelling and creative solution. So it's an acronym, because I'm told a lot of businesses and a lot of professionals like acronyms. Most of the training we do, we have acronyms sort of all over the walls in various companies. So if you can't beat them, join them in this context. So let's see what it stands for. A is about getting their attention. You know, senior managers like you, they're very, very busy people. You've seen that house that they live in. There's so much going on. And it's our job to get their attention very, very quickly. So you can do that with a story, you could do it with a quote, you could do it with perhaps a short video, but a powerful video, maybe a slide, maybe a statistic, maybe you can shock or surprise them, but whatever you do, you have to get their attention early. They need to know they're in the right room, they need to feel curious, and they need to feel interested. And then as you've got your attention, you need to make sure that everything you say, everything you show, and everything you do is relevant to one of those elements or whatever it is that you're presenting on that ties into their house that they live in. You know, those features that we showed on the slide earlier, whether it's quality, whether it's leadership, whether it's cost, whether it's revenue, but it has to be relevant. And then at the middle of this acronym, it should actually be at the front, but it would ruin the whole acronym, of course, is message. What is your message? Because if you're not clear, then you can be 100% certain they won't be either. So we need to really focus on that in that 140 characters and play that message a few times, not repetitively just for the sake of it, but so they get it during the context of the presentation. And E is for examples. People live by examples. Give them examples. Don't just dump the data and information. Bring it to life. Bring it to life through stories and analogies and metaphors, and tell them what you mean. Because that's how they'll get it, and that's our job, to make sure they get it at the end of the day. And we've already talked about the D. The D is they need to know, what do you want them to do? Why did you take up their time? Why didn't you just send them an email? What is it you want them to do, having just taken up 20 minutes of their life, or whatever that number is? So if we avoid those mistakes, and if we craft and prepare our presentation using the acronym ARMED, then we're a long, long way ahead in terms of building that solution. That means we can not only have the impact that we want, but we connect more effectively. I want to close in a moment, but I want to leave you with one final thought. This is a picture of my son. My son's name is Reese. Reese is in his final year at Warwick University, and this is a picture of him his first day at school, and I share it with you because I remember it well. Reese sat on the front row of the assembly hall with his mother and I, listening to the headmaster, when he was 5 years old, give a talk about the rules for the next 7 years. And something like 10 minutes into the talk, Reese looked up at me with these sad eyes and he said, "Daddy, this story's really giving me a headache. What time will it finish?" And of course I laughed and reassured him, but then, you know, I thought, oh my word, he's right. This story's giving me a headache too. And what was worse was that I knew that when I'd finished that assembly, I was going to go back to work, and I was going to be on the receiving end of many more headaches. Not from bad people doing a bad job, just because so many presenters were on autopilot, like this headmaster. And I knew there was another way. So the next time you are presenting or asked to present to your senior management team, or indeed anyone, because we're just focusing on senior managers at this stage, we're presenting to anyone. I'd like you just to give a thought to my son, Reese, sitting on that cold, hard plastic chair on the assembly hall, listening to that headmaster. And promise yourself that you'll avoid those 7 mistakes that we talked about earlier, and that you will do your utmost to connect emotionally as well as intellectually. And here are the 7 mistakes again that you can avoid. They're all in the article that I wrote, and there's a lot more detail in there as well, but I just wanted to summarize those for you as we move forward. So I've left you with that thought, and I'd like to hand over to Julia now to see if there are any questions.
Yes, thanks very much, Morris, for this insightful presentation. So before we move into the Q&A, let me just add that due to the location of your managers and executive, you may find that you are asked to present via an online meeting tool to save time and expense traveling. So today you've experienced what it's like to listen and interact to a presentation via GoToWebinar. But if you'd like to see what it's like being the presenter yourself, you can start, of course, a free trial of either GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar yourself. So my colleague Gemma is chatting the link out for you now, so you can learn more on our website. It's free, no credit card required, and alternatively, you can also request a trial via the exit survey. So we are very happy if you answer the exit survey and give us some feedback for today's presentation, and then you can request a trial. So and now let's jump into the Q&A part of the webinar, as I already collected a lot of interesting questions for you, Morris. So the first question comes from Rebecca. She asks, how can I prevent and or manage shaking during a presentation?
To prevent and or manage shaking. Okay, that's a common issue that a lot of people struggle with, and one great way of doing it, and it's one of these things I'm sure you've heard before, but it's like so many things in life. We hear and we understand, but we don't always do them to the extent that we need to do them. And it's about breathing. It's about breathing into your presentation. A lot of presenters, and I used to do this many, many years ago in the corporate world myself, you know, we know we're about to speak and we spend the 2 or 3 minutes immediately before we're about to speak panicking and worrying and focusing on the house of me and all that negative stuff. What we need to do is to have the mindfulness and the level of consciousness to say, listen, I've prepared as best I can, I've done my homework, I've done my research, I've crafted this presentation, and now it's my time to focus on the audience. But before I do that, let me just center myself and breathe. So what I tell people to do is just to spend literally 2 minutes just in the comfort of their own mind. They don't even have to close their eyes. If they can do it, even better. But in the comfort of their own mind, just to breathe in for the count of 5, but breathe in so that you can feel your diaphragm pushing out, because a lot of us breathe just through the chest, and that can make our legs shake and make us even more wobbly. So we breathe diaphragmatically. We breathe in through the nose so we can feel our stomach going out for 5, and then we hold it, and then we breathe out for 5. And we just focus on the breath, and we just do that repeatedly, just for, you do it for at least a minute, preferably a couple of minutes. So it doesn't take away, of course, from the preparation and the rehearsal and the practice and really knowing your stuff, but a really good thing you can do is to breathe. The other thing that I encourage people to do is, because remember, we've got this reptilian brain kicking in, so we've got all the fight or flight, adrenaline, cortisol, is before you present, find some space where you can just shake your muscles and loosen out your muscles and really do some stretching, facial stretching, shake your arms, shake your legs, run up and down on the spot. Just let some of that adrenaline go as well, because physically you need to dispel some of that tension. Hopefully that's helpful.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah, and then Dennis is asking, what are you doing if you notice that people are not interested in what you're talking about and they seem bored during the presentation?
Well, if it's, again, a lot of that can be judgmental. We make a lot of assumptions as presenters, you know, especially if you're presenting to a large group. Let's say you've got a room full of let's say you've got 20 people in a room and you see one or two people may yawn or look at their BlackBerry or whisper something to the person next to them. Often we've got this horrible technical human trait called head stuff, which means that we automatically think, oh no, they're bored or they hate me or I've lost them or I've gone wrong or whatever. And of course that's possible, but it's highly unlikely if it's just one or two people. The fact is that's what human beings do, especially in this information age. People do look at their BlackBerries and, you know, we are stifled of oxygen, so we do yawn and we will speak to somebody sitting next to us. Now, if it's all of the audience doing it, then you have to change tact, you have to change focus. But what I say to people is drop the assumptions and those judgments and just continue with your message. If you clearly feel that nobody's getting it, then you need to liven it up. You need to move in a different direction, and maybe you need to re-engage them with a powerful story or a powerful quote or something that's going to really get them thinking. Or you bring them in. So you might get them to do a little exercise, play something out, or ask them a question, a really thought-provoking question. But your job then, if you really believe you've lost them, is to bring them back. And there are lots of ways of doing that. That's just a few that I mentioned.
Okay. In your experience, or do you think it's easier to present to strangers or to people that you already know?
Well, again, it's a really mixed view. We work with people in workshops, both in-house in big businesses and public workshops and one-to-one coaching. And every week, in fact, every day, I can tell you, we hear a mixed view. Some people say, I'm terrified with strangers. Some people say, I'm terrified with colleagues or people that I know. There doesn't seem to be any rules. It really is a mixed view. The really good thing, though, about presenting is, repetition is the mother of learning, and repetition is the mother of skill. So what I encourage people to do is to really push themselves to do as much as they can of it, because presenting is one of these things. It's a critical skill in business today. It really is. It's not going away. It's just going to become have more and more of a place, a bigger part in our lives. So to take ourselves out of our comfort zone and to practice. So whether it's strangers or whether it's people you know, it's just to reframe and refocus it from saying this is something that I dread as something that potentially could go wrong. So this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to make a tangible difference to somebody else's professional life or personal life, if it's that kind of presentation, and to reframe the whole thing and to be excited about it, but to do as many as you can. And the thing that I would wrap all of that up in is to have the intent of having a conversation rather than just giving a lecture.
Mm-hmm. There is one more interesting question from Carlo, who asked, based on your framework, what should I be focused on, or how should I handle the situation in case I have 10 minutes only, to present to senior management about a topic where I did not have too much time to go through the strategy phase?
Okay, so let's look at that, because that's where the ARMED model, you remember the acronym that I showed you, which is a big part of it, that's a hugely powerful model, not to be underestimated. When I came across that a few years ago, funny enough, from another training company that I did some associate work with, it was one of the most powerful things I've seen, and I use it to good effect, because I teach people both on a one-to-one basis and in workshops to take a message that sometimes they spend anything up to 2 hours, from 20 minutes or 2 hours delivering, to deliver that in 90 seconds, sometimes 60 seconds. And when people first look at it, they think, their mindset or their approach is, that's impossible. How can I take something that would normally take me 20 minutes to do and deliver it in 90 seconds? Because if you just focus on that model that says, what can I do to get their attention? And that relates to not being a comedian. So remember, that's bringing the key message up front. So, whether it's helping them to feel that pleasure and that sense of happiness, and to avoid the pain and to feel free. So it's getting their attention in a profound way, making sure that they know that it's relevant, making sure that the message is clear, that you bring it to life with some examples, and then you tell them what you want to do. You could prepare that. When I run our workshops, I get people to prepare a 90-second presentation. I give them no more than 5 minutes to prepare and 90 seconds to do it. And the results, I have to tell you, are, well, they're remarkable.
Great. So we've almost arrived at the end of the presentation, but I'd just like to give some more questions to you, because we have so many interesting questions in the chat and still a lot of attendees, so I think it's worth asking some more questions.
Sure.
What do you think, how do you think, or how do you would handle having to present material that is not your own material? Because Sandra says that she was given brand new material the night before the presentation and then had to deal with it.
Well, Sandra's not going to like the answer to that, but you know, in the context of being mindful, and part of being mindful is being honest, then I would do my utmost not to do that, because it's happened to me in the past and it's a very unnerving, uncomfortable and inappropriate thing to do. And whoever, from a leadership perspective, has, I guess, you know, let's, for want of a better word, the nerve or the audacity to give somebody material at the last minute to present, then that's not effective leadership. So it shouldn't be done. So the first thing I would do is push back to say that it's not in the audience's interest for me to present something that I'm not highly conversant and comfortable with in the first place. Because why would you do that to another human being anyway? So that's a leadership issue. That's the first conversation I would have. That's the first thing. The second thing is to say to Sandra, well, I appreciate, because in the real world, sometimes we don't have that gift and we just can't do that. So then what I would do is I would spend as much time sitting with the human being that crafted and prepared that material and taking out the key elements. So you're not going to be able to absorb all of it, but taking out the key elements in the context of that model again, that armed model, and saying, how can I absorb what that person's intent is in terms of the message into that model to get that across in a language and in a way that works for me. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, then one more question, maybe for the end, regarding virtual presentations. If you have to present via online meeting, virtual conference to your senior management, do you have any tips or tricks for that?
Yes, I do, and it's to me it's the same thing. It's about preparation, it's about having the strategy clear, and it's about not seeing the technology, whether it's, you know, a GoToMeeting webinar or whatever tool it is you're using, not to see that as an inhibitor, because again it's about reframing that, because at the end of the day, you know, we've got several hundred people on this participating on this webinar today. I think, you know, well over 1,000 registered, so there's a great number of people, and you know, I know you're controlling that from your side in terms of who they are and where they are, but from my perspective, all I want to know is that to add as much value as I can. So in terms of the way I'm crafting and focusing the message and my content, because content is king first and foremost, and then to almost forget the technology, but to recognize that people are watching you, people are absorbing the information, and it's our job to do the same thing that you would if you had them in a room, to really engage with, you know, your body language, vocally, eye contact, even though you can't see them, but it's kind of imagining that they're all in a room with you, and that's really the best that you can do.
Great, great tips. Thanks, Morris. Yeah, well, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave it there as we have reached the end of the webinar. Thank you, Morris, for such an insightful presentation. Thank you for taking the time out to join us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you on another webinar soon. Thanks to all of you.